I still remember the moment that changed everything, a moment when, amid the wreckage of our bankrupt company, a spark of inspiration lit up my mind like a lightning bolt. I had just stared at spreadsheets of loss and looming debt for what felt like an eternity when it hit me. Travel isn't just about getting from point A to point B, it's an experience, a journey of discovery that, if done right, could transform lives. In those first 100 words, my heart pounded with hope and urgency. I envisioned a travel software so revolutionary that it would not only save our sinking business but also launch it into an entirely new stratosphere. Little did I know, this daring idea would catapult our company from the depths of bankruptcy to a mind-blowing $400 million in profit. And then, just when I thought I had finally arrived, my own father fired me. It all began during one of those long, sleepless nights at the office when the weight of failure was almost too much to bear. Our company, once a promising travel agency with big dreams and even bigger plans, had spiraled into financial ruin. The numbers were grim, and every board meeting felt like a grim reminder that our legacy was hanging by a thread. I remember sitting at my cluttered desk, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead mixing with the quiet sound of my own doubts. I was drowning in a sea of debt and despair, questioning whether there was any way out. And then, in the midst of that darkness, the idea struck me. What if I could leverage technology, create software that would revolutionize the way people plan and experience travel? I spent days and nights sketching out ideas on napkins, whiteboards, and any scrap of paper I could find. The concept was simple yet daring, an intuitive platform that could offer personalized travel itineraries based on user preferences, real-time updates on weather, local events, and even dynamic pricing to secure the best deals. I poured every ounce of my hope, every bit of my restless energy, into this project. I wasn't just designing software, I was crafting a lifeline for our company, a beacon in the storm of bankruptcy. In the early days, I worked relentlessly, fueled by a mixture of caffeine and a stubborn belief that I could turn our fortunes around. I coded late into the night, often losing track of time as lines of code and algorithmic formulas began to coalesce into something that looked like a functioning product. I remember the exhilaration of that first successful test run, the screen lighting up with travel options and personalized itineraries, and the realization that this could actually work. I felt like I was witnessing a miracle unfold right before my eyes. The project quickly took on a life of its own. I rallied a small team of like-minded innovators, programmers, designers, and travel enthusiasts who believed in the vision as much as I did. We called our creation Globetrotter, a name that evoked adventure and boundless possibilities. Every member of the team worked as if our very survival depended on it, and soon enough, Globetrotter evolved from a rough prototype to a polished, market-ready product. Our once-dying company began to show signs of revival. Investors started taking notice as Globetrotter attracted attention from major travel partners and tech enthusiasts alike. As Globetrotter hit the market, the transformation was nothing short of astonishing. Bookings soared, partnerships flourished, and what had once been a company on the brink of collapse was now buzzing with energy and optimism. Within a few short months, our profits skyrocketed, and we turned a $400 million profit, a figure that I still struggle to wrap my head around. It was as if our innovative software had unlocked a hidden treasure trove, breathing new life into a business that many had written off. For a while, it seemed like I had finally achieved everything I'd ever dreamed of. I had saved the company, proven my worth as a visionary, and, most importantly, restored hope in a place that had nearly given up on itself. The success of Globetrotter became a shining beacon in my career, a testament to what can happen when you dare to innovate even in the darkest of times. I was proud, energized, and ready to take on the world. But just when I thought my journey was on an unstoppable upward trajectory, reality came crashing back in the most unexpected way. My own father, once a pillar of support and the person whose approval I had always craved, decided that my role in the company was no longer welcome. In a board meeting that I can still recall with a bitter twist of disbelief, he fired me. The man who had nurtured my early ambitions, who had watched me grow and learn the ropes of the business, now saw me as expendable. His words were cold and clinical, delivered with a detachment that cut deeper than any financial loss. It felt like the ultimate betrayal. I had poured my heart and soul into saving the company, and in return, I was cast aside by the one person whose opinion meant the most to me. The shock of being fired by my own father sent me reeling. I had expected tough love, perhaps even constructive criticism, but not outright dismissal. I couldn't understand how someone who had once celebrated my every success could now look at me with such disinterest. The meeting ended, and I walked out of the boardroom with a heavy heart, a mix of confusion, anger, and profound sadness swirling within me. I had become a hero to the company, the architect of its miraculous turnaround, and yet, I was now nothing more than a disposable asset in his eyes. That evening, I sat alone in my small office, the hum of the computer the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. I replayed every conversation, every nod of approval, and tried desperately to pinpoint where things had gone wrong. Had I done something to provoke this? Was it something in my performance, my attitude, or was it simply a shift in my father's own ambitions? The answers were elusive, and the sense of betrayal gnawed at me relentlessly. I left the building that night with no clear direction, unsure of what the future held for me. I felt a profound emptiness, like all the energy, passion, and purpose that had fueled my work on Globetrekker was suddenly evaporated. I wandered the dark streets, the neon signs of the city blurring into a canvas of regret and lost opportunities. Every step I took was heavy with the realization that sometimes, success isn't enough if you're not recognized by the people you love. In the quiet solitude of my apartment later that night, I began to document my thoughts in a journal, an outlet for the storm of emotions crashing over me. I wrote about the thrill of creation, the euphoria of turning a bankrupt company around, and the crushing disappointment of being discarded by my own blood. I questioned whether my achievements meant anything if they were met with such cold rejection. The pages filled with raw honesty, each word a small act of defiance against the sting of my father's decision. As the days passed, I oscillated between numbness and fury. I reached out to mentors and friends, seeking advice, validation, and a way to make sense of it all. Some told me to see it as a new beginning, a chance to start fresh, unburdened by the past. Others, however, were more cynical, warning me that family bonds are often as fragile as they are complicated. I spent countless hours in coffee shops and late-night phone calls, trying to navigate the labyrinth of emotions and decisions that lay ahead. At the same time, the success of Globetrekker continued to soar. The company, now thriving under new management, was making headlines and turning heads in the travel industry. I followed the news with a bittersweet mix of pride and sorrow, knowing that while I had been the one to spark this incredible turnaround, I was no longer a part of the story. It felt like watching a masterpiece unfold on the big screen, knowing you played the lead role, yet being forced to sit in the back row as someone else took center stage. In those moments, I began to question my identity. Who was I without the company, without the recognition of my innovative mind? The loss was not just professional, it was deeply personal. I felt adrift, unsure of where to anchor myself next. Yet, amid the pain, a small voice inside me whispered that this was not the end. It urged me to remember the passion that had driven me to create Globetrekker, to harness that same energy to build something new, something that was entirely my own. I started to take tentative steps toward reclaiming my life. I reached out to old colleagues, former friends from the tech community, and even investors who had once admired my work. I explored new opportunities, considering projects that had always piqued my interest but that I'd set aside for the sake of the company. I began to see that being fired wasn't the end of the road, it was merely a detour, a painful one, but a detour nonetheless. I resolved to use this setback as fuel for a new venture, one that would allow me to harness my skills and creativity without the shadow of family drama looming overhead. Slowly, I started sketching out ideas for a new startup. I envisioned a platform that would integrate travel with immersive experiences, a tool for wanderers looking to truly connect with the places they visited. The concept was raw and unpolished at first, but it excited me in a way that nothing else had in a long time. Every late night spent coding and brainstorming felt like a rebellion against the injustice I'd suffered. I wasn't just trying to prove something to the world, I was trying to prove it to myself, too. My journey wasn't easy. There were days when the old wounds cut deep, when I questioned whether I had the strength to start over. But I began to find solace in small victories, a supportive text from a friend, a successful prototype, a moment of clarity in a frustrating day. I learned to channel my anger and hurt into my work, transforming them into determination and drive. The passion that had once saved our bankrupt company was still within me, burning steadily despite the setbacks. I also sought professional help to process the emotional turmoil. Therapy sessions became a regular part of my routine, offering me a safe space to confront my feelings about being fired by my father. I learned that sometimes, our greatest breakthroughs come from the hardest falls, and that letting go of old hurts is essential for moving forward. These sessions taught me to view my past not as a series of failures, but as a collection of lessons that had shaped me into the person I was becoming, a person who was capable of reinventing himself and carving out a new destiny. As I delved deeper into my new project, I also began to reconnect with the parts of me that I had neglected for years. I rekindled my love for reading, exploring books on innovation, leadership, and personal growth. I joined local meetups and tech conferences, slowly rebuilding a network of like-minded individuals who believed in the power of reinvention. Each interaction, each shared story of overcoming adversity, reinforced my belief that my journey was far from over, it was just beginning. One particularly memorable evening, I was invited to speak at a startup event about innovation and resilience. Standing in front of a room of eager faces, I recounted the roller coaster of my experience, from the exhilaration of creating travel software that saved a dying company to the crushing disappointment of being fired by my own father. I spoke candidly about the pain, the sleepless nights, and the eventual realization that sometimes, the worst setbacks pave the way for the greatest comebacks. The audience's response was overwhelming. Their applause, nods of understanding, and follow-up questions affirmed that my story, as painful as it was, resonated with others. It was a humbling moment, one that cemented my decision to move forward, not in anger or bitterness, but in a hopeful pursuit of a new beginning. Now, as I sit in my modest office, staring at the prototype of my new startup on my computer screen, I feel a profound sense of gratitude mixed with cautious optimism. The road ahead is still uncertain, and the scars of the past may never fully fade, but I know one thing for sure: I have the power to define my own worth, independent of anyone else's judgment. My journey, from the triumphant creation of innovative travel software to the searing pain of being cast aside, has taught me that success isn't measured by titles or the approval of others. It's measured by the resilience of the human spirit, the courage to start over, and the unwavering belief that you can rise from even the deepest setbacks. I'm not sure where this new venture will take me, or how many more obstacles I'll have to overcome. But I do know that I'm ready to embrace the challenge. I'm ready to build a future where my dreams are mine alone, where my innovations, my work, and my passions define me, not the narrow judgments of those who once tried to hold me back. In this new chapter of my life, I choose to be the master of my own destiny, to harness the lessons of my past, and to forge a path that leads to fulfillment, creativity, and, ultimately, true freedom. Man, if I could rewind time to those sleepless nights right after we launched Globetrekker, I'd probably still be reeling from the wild mix of euphoria and dread. Picture this: we were riding high, our travel software was turning the company around in ways I'd only dreamed of. The excitement in the office was contagious. Every meeting was a celebration, every email from a new investor was a high five to our survival, and every new booking was proof that we were finally back from the edge of bankruptcy. For a while, I thought we had cracked the code to revolutionizing travel. I was on cloud nine, convinced that I had finally redeemed myself as a visionary. But then, right as the champagne was flowing and profits were climbing, the storm started to brew. I started noticing subtle shifts at work, whispers in the corridors, sideways glances from some of the senior execs, and a growing distance from the guy I'd always thought of as my biggest supporter, my own father. I remember one late afternoon, as I was debugging a particularly gnarly piece of code, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a terse message that simply said, "We need to talk." My heart sank a bit, because I had the sinking feeling that something was off. I brushed it off at first, focusing on the work at hand, but the sense of foreboding only grew stronger as the day turned to night. By the time I left the office that day, I was on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that the triumph we'd just celebrated was now intertwined with an undercurrent of impending doom. Over the next few days, I noticed that my father's presence around the office was notably absent. Instead of his usual encouraging nods and pat-on-the-back moments, there was an uncomfortable silence. It wasn't long before the whispers reached my ears. People were saying that he had called an emergency board meeting. I tried to remain calm, telling myself that maybe it was just a routine checkup of the books, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. The meeting came out of nowhere, on a grey Wednesday morning. I walked into the conference room, expecting to discuss strategies for scaling Globetrekker even further. Instead, I was met with a room full of somber faces and my father sitting at the head of the table, looking far too serious for someone who had once been my rock. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. With a tone that was both icy and clinical, he told everyone that he'd made a decision regarding the company's future, and that decision, to my absolute disbelief, involved firing me. I remember feeling a cocktail of shock, anger, and betrayal hit me all at once. Here I was, riding the wave of a miraculous turnaround that I'd helped engineer, and now I was being cast aside like an old, outdated piece of code. I tried to speak, to ask why, but my father's words cut through the room before I could even form a sentence. "Your vision and efforts have been noted," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "But I've decided that your role here is no longer necessary." And just like that, in front of the entire board and my colleagues, my future at the company I had saved, was abruptly terminated. Walking out of that meeting felt surreal. I was numb, my mind racing to reconcile the paradox of being both the savior of our company and now its outcast. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, barely acknowledging my co-workers' sympathetic looks. All I could think about was how everything I'd worked for had been twisted into a cruel joke by someone I'd trusted more than anyone else. I left the building that day feeling like I was walking on shattered glass, every step a reminder of my fall from grace. The success of Globetrotter, which had been such a vindication of my skills and passion, now felt like a bittersweet trophy of my own undoing. I found myself questioning everything. Had I been too caught up in my own ambition? Was my father's decision driven by personal grudges or just a different vision for the company's future? I couldn't tell. All I knew was that I was now on my own, forced to pick up the pieces of my identity and rebuild my career from scratch. That night, as I sat alone in my cramped apartment, the silence was overwhelming. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the meeting over and over in my head, trying to understand how the man who had once inspired me could now look at me with such cold detachment. I scribbled furiously in my journal, letting the raw emotions spill out in a torrent of words. I wrote about the thrill of creating something groundbreaking and the bitter sting of being unceremoniously discarded by my own father. It was a mess of conflicting feelings, pride for what I had accomplished, sorrow for the personal betrayal, and a gnawing fear of what the future now held for me. In the days that followed, I dove headfirst into self-reflection. I reached out to a few trusted mentors, old friends in the tech world who'd seen me through tough times before. Over cups of strong coffee in quiet, offbeat cafes, we talked about what had happened. One mentor, a seasoned entrepreneur named Alex, told me, "Sometimes, family and business don't mix, no matter how much you wish they would. You have to decide if you're willing to let this setback define you or if you're going to let it fuel your comeback." Those words hit me hard. I realized that, as painful as this was, I had a choice. I could let this break me, or I could use it as the impetus to forge a new path, a path that was entirely mine. I began to explore new opportunities with a cautious optimism. I applied for roles in other tech companies, even considered launching my own startup again, but this time on my own terms. The process was grueling. Every interview, every rejection letter, was a reminder of the void that had been left by my abrupt exit. But with every setback, I also discovered a deeper resilience in myself, a stubborn refusal to be defined by one man's decision. I started networking at industry events, reconnecting with people who valued innovation and bold ideas. Slowly, I began to piece together a new vision for my future, one that wasn't tied to the legacy of a company I'd once saved but abandoned. Meanwhile, the success of Globetrotter continued to make headlines, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of bittersweet pride every time I saw an article about the turnaround. It was like watching a masterpiece from which you'd been unceremoniously ejected, both awe-inspiring and deeply personal. I knew that my creation had changed the travel industry and saved a sinking business, and that gave me a sense of purpose. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the innovation, the creativity, and the sheer determination that had carried us from the brink of bankruptcy to unimaginable success. At the same time, I began to process the more personal fallout of my father's decision. It wasn't just a professional setback, it was a rupture in our relationship that I wasn't sure could be mended. I reached out to him, hoping to have a heart-to-heart conversation, but every attempt was met with cold formality. Our once warm exchanges had been replaced by terse emails and distant phone calls. I realized that I needed to find a way to move forward, even if that meant accepting that some family ties might never fully heal. To cope with the emotional strain, I threw myself into creative projects. I revisited my passion for writing, channeling the hurt, the anger, and the hope of a new beginning into short stories and personal essays. I even started a blog to document my journey, a raw, honest account of the rollercoaster ride that had been my life over the past few months. The blog quickly attracted a small but engaged readership, people who found solace and strength in my words. Their support reminded me that, even in the midst of betrayal, there were others who understood and valued my story. As weeks turned into months, I slowly started to rebuild my confidence. I enrolled in advanced coding classes and attended industry conferences, determined to stay at the forefront of innovation. I found that the fire that had once fueled Globetrotter was still burning within me, albeit a bit dimmer, waiting for the right moment to reignite. I even considered partnering with a few former colleagues to launch a new venture, a project that would combine my love for technology and travel, but with a fresh, independent vision. Despite the ups and downs, I began to see a pattern emerging in my personal growth. Every setback, every harsh word, every moment of doubt was gradually transforming into a stepping stone. I realized that I wasn't defined solely by the success of one project or the opinion of one person, not even my father. I was more than a failed experiment or a discarded employee. I was a creator, an innovator, and someone with a resilient spirit capable of forging a new path, no matter how winding. I also found unexpected support in the unlikeliest of places. One evening at a tech meetup, I struck up a conversation with a fellow entrepreneur who had faced similar family drama and professional rejection. He told me, "Sometimes the hardest hits in life force you to strip away the things that don't really matter. Use this as a chance to reinvent yourself. What you create next will be all the more powerful because it comes from the raw truth of your experience." That conversation was a turning point, a reminder that every scar told a story of survival and that my future could be even brighter if I embraced the lessons of the past. In those moments of quiet reflection, I also started to confront the personal doubts that had crept into my mind. I kept asking myself, what truly defines success? Is it the approval of those around me, or is it the belief in my own vision? Slowly, I began to see that the answer lay within me. The rejection I had faced, as bitter as it was, forced me to look inward and rediscover who I was before all the pressure, expectations, and corporate drama took over my life. I began setting boundaries for myself, both professionally and personally. I learned to say no when opportunities didn't align with my newfound values and to surround myself with people who genuinely believed in my potential. I reconnected with friends who had always been there for me, and even though it was painful to hear stories of their own disappointments, it made me feel less isolated. We'd gather at local bars or over dinner, talking about our dreams, our failures, and everything in between. Those conversations, filled with raw honesty and mutual support, helped me see that I wasn't alone in this fight, that many of us were battling our own demons, trying to find our place in a world that often seemed indifferent to our struggles. As I slowly started to rebuild my professional identity, I took on freelance projects that allowed me to experiment with new ideas without the heavy weight of a corporate structure. I worked with small startups, helping them streamline their operations with innovative software solutions. Each project was a reminder that my skills were still valuable, that I could still create something meaningful from scratch. The more I worked, the more I began to reclaim the pride I once had in my work. The fire of innovation was rekindling, and it felt like I was slowly stitching together a future that was entirely my own. And then there were the moments of profound clarity, quiet evenings when the world seemed to pause, and I could truly reflect on how far I had come. I'd sit on the balcony of my modest apartment, looking out at the city lights, and I'd realize that while the pain of being fired by my own father would always be a part of my story, it didn't have to dictate my future. I had the power to shape my own destiny, to build a new legacy from the ashes of what had once been. I started to see that every rejection, every setback, was just a part of the process, a necessary detour on the road to discovering who I really was. One of the most liberating realizations I had was that success wasn't just about the numbers, the profits, or the accolades, it was about the journey. It was about waking up every day with the determination to be true to yourself, even when the odds were stacked against you. I began to write more, not just for my blog, but for myself, a way to capture my thoughts, my dreams, and my gradual transformation. In those words, I found a sense of ownership over my narrative, a narrative that I was now in control of, regardless of what others had thought or said. The months rolled on, and I started to see a future emerging from the chaos, a future that wasn't defined by the shadows of my past, but illuminated by the promise of new beginnings. I was still healing, still learning, but I was no longer the same person who had once walked out of that boardroom feeling utterly betrayed. I had grown, in ways both painful and profound, and I was ready to embrace the next chapter of my life. I was ready to prove to myself and to the world that a setback, even one as personal as being fired by your own father, could be the catalyst for something incredible. As I wrap up this part of my journey, I look back at those early days with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. The pain was real, and the betrayal stung more than I can ever express, but it forced me to confront the very core of who I was and what I was capable of. It taught me resilience, independence, and the importance of self-belief, lessons that no amount of corporate success or family approval could ever replace. I'm still on this journey, and I know there will be more challenges ahead, but for now, I'm learning to ride the waves of uncertainty with a steady heart and a clear vision. I remember the day after the board meeting like it was yesterday. I walked out of that conference room feeling numb and utterly betrayed. I'd poured every ounce of my passion into creating GlobeTrekker, that revolutionary travel software that not only rescued our company from the brink but skyrocketed it into a $400 million profit zone. I was riding the high of innovation and determination, until my own dad, the guy I'd always looked up to, told me I was no longer welcome. It hit me hard. One minute I was the savior, the visionary behind our turnaround, and the next, I was tossed aside as if my contributions meant nothing. That was the turning point. I spent that evening walking through the city streets, trying to process the bitter cocktail of pride and rejection. I couldn't believe that after everything I'd done, my father could see me as expendable. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, with all the accolades of our success below me and a vast, uncertain future stretching out ahead. And then, with nothing but raw emotion and a burning determination to reclaim my self-worth, I decided that I was done living under someone else's expectations. For the next few weeks, I went into survival mode. I wasn't sure if I'd ever get over the shock, but I knew one thing: I had to start building something new, something that belonged solely to me. I took a step back from the travel software world. No, not because I doubted my work, but because I needed time to reassemble my identity outside the corporate machine. I began reconnecting with old friends from the tech scene, the ones who always told me I had a spark, even when everything looked bleak. Over countless cups of coffee and long late-night talks, I learned that sometimes a breakup, no matter how personal, can be the push you need to find your true direction. I eventually rented a small, unpretentious office space in a co-working hub downtown. It wasn't fancy, but it felt liberating, like a blank slate. I dove headfirst into brainstorming sessions, mapping out new ideas, and rethinking the way I wanted to shape my career. I realized that being fired by my own father wasn't a full stop, it was just a comma in a longer story that I was now ready to rewrite. I started working on a new project, something different yet familiar. Drawing on my background in travel tech, I envisioned a platform that didn't just offer itineraries or deals, but that genuinely personalized every journey. I wanted to create a tool that could adapt to the unique tastes, budgets, and even the spontaneous whims of travelers. I spent long nights coding and sketching designs, fueled by the kind of gritty determination that only comes when you've been knocked down hard. Every bug fixed, every feature added, was a small act of rebellion against the sting of that boardroom moment. I wasn't just building software, I was rebuilding myself. During this time, I also took a hard look at my own life. I attended therapy sessions, not because I was weak, but because I needed to understand how being cast aside by the very people who should have championed me had impacted my self-worth. My therapist, someone who had seen many cases of professional heartbreak, helped me see that my value wasn't tied to a title or a paycheck. She said, "Your contributions are your own." Sometimes, the hardest part is realizing that success isn't about everyone else's approval, it's about believing in yourself enough to start over. Those words became my mantra. I started journaling daily, not just about work, but about life, my goals, my failures, my small wins. With every entry, I felt the weight of my past get a little lighter. I began to immerse myself in the vibrant startup community that had grown in the city. I attended meetups, networked with fellow entrepreneurs, and even found a few investors who were interested in my new vision. Slowly, the sting of my father's rejection began to dull as I realized that I had a lot to offer: ideas that were fresh, skills that were honed through hard-won experience, and a perspective that could only come from having been thrown into the deep end. I embraced the uncertainty of the future and started to see my journey not as a series of setbacks, but as the very process of reinvention. One of the most pivotal moments came during a panel discussion at a tech conference. I was invited to speak about innovation in the face of adversity, a topic that hit painfully close to home. Standing on that stage, looking out at a sea of expectant faces, I shared the raw, unfiltered truth about my experience, how I had built a groundbreaking piece of software that saved a dying company, only to be cast out by my own father. I talked about the shock, the heartbreak, and ultimately, the discovery that I was capable of starting over. The response was overwhelming. The applause wasn't just for the success of Globetrotter, it was for my resilience, for my willingness to face the darkest parts of my story and use them as fuel for something new. In that moment, I realized that I wasn't alone. There were countless others who had faced similar betrayals and had come out stronger on the other side. That day, I left the conference with a renewed sense of purpose. I knew that my journey was far from over, but I also knew that I had finally started to chart my own course. I decided to officially launch my new venture, calling it Voyage Next, a nod to the idea that every journey is about what comes next. It was a modest beginning, but it symbolized everything I had learned, that innovation is not a destination, but a continuous evolution, and that sometimes, being forced out of one door is the catalyst to open another. I remember the first time I saw an investor show genuine interest in Voyage Next. It was at a networking event at a local innovation hub. A well-dressed investor approached me and said, "I've been following your work, and your story resonates with me. I see real potential here." That simple interaction, that acknowledgement of my ideas and my journey, was like a balm for my wounded pride. It reminded me that, despite the rejection from my own family, there were people out there who believed in my vision, people who valued what I had to offer. That day, I felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps this setback wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning of something even greater. Meanwhile, the success of Globetrotter continued to make waves in the industry. I couldn't help but feel a bittersweet mix of pride and melancholy when I read about the company's soaring profits and groundbreaking achievements. I knew that I had been the catalyst for that transformation, yet I was no longer part of that narrative. But over time, I learned to appreciate that success isn't a zero-sum game. The fact that my former creation was thriving meant that my work had truly made an impact. It was proof that my ideas, born from desperate times and sleepless nights, had the power to change the world. And that realization gave me the courage to pursue my new path with all the passion I had left. There were, of course, moments when the old pain would resurface unexpectedly. A meeting that reminded me of the boardroom shock, a news article that mentioned the company's turnaround, or even a quiet night when I found myself alone with my thoughts. During those times, I'd revisit my journal, reread the raw, unfiltered entries that captured the heartache of being fired by my own father. It wasn't about wallowing in the past, it was about acknowledging it, learning from it, and then letting it go. I reminded myself that every scar was a badge of honor, a testament to the battles I'd fought and survived. In the midst of rebuilding my professional life, I also focused on healing the personal wounds. I began reconnecting with family members who had always been there, even when things were falling apart. I sought to understand my father's perspective, not to excuse his actions, but to come to terms with them. It was a long, painful process, filled with difficult conversations and moments of raw vulnerability. I learned that sometimes, the people who hurt you the most are also the ones struggling with their own demons. While our relationship might never be the same, I realized that forgiving him, at least in my own heart, was essential for my own peace of mind. Over time, I also began to rebuild a sense of community outside of work. I joined a local hiking club, started volunteering at a nonprofit dedicated to helping aspiring entrepreneurs, and even took a few weekend trips to clear my head. These experiences helped me see that life was full of possibilities, that the world was much bigger than the narrow corridor of corporate politics and family drama. I found joy in the simple moments, watching a sunrise over a mountain, laughing with new friends over dinner, or even just enjoying a quiet evening with a good book. Slowly, I started to stitch together a new tapestry of life, one where my worth wasn't determined by the approval of my father or the success of a single project, but by my own resilience, creativity, and willingness to keep moving forward. And so, here I am today, still on this journey, still learning, and still driven by the same passion that once sparked the creation of Globetrotter. I've come to understand that setbacks, no matter how painful, can be the catalyst for the most profound personal transformations. I've learned to view my father's rejection not as the end of my story, but as a necessary detour that forced me to dig deep, redefine my identity, and ultimately, build something new from the ashes of my past. Every day, as I sit in my modest office, filled with sketches, codes, and notes for Voyage Next, I remind myself that I am more than a title, more than the sum of one company's success. I am a creator, an innovator, and a person with a resilient spirit that refuses to be held back by outdated expectations. The road ahead is still uncertain, and there will undoubtedly be more challenges along the way. But I now know that my worth is not defined by anyone else's opinions, it's something I create for myself, one decision, one breakthrough, one step at a time. Looking back, I can't help but feel a mix of gratitude and determination for all that I've been through. The shock of being fired by my own father, the bittersweet triumph of saving a company from bankruptcy, and the arduous journey of rebuilding my life have all taught me invaluable lessons. I've learned that innovation comes from the willingness to risk everything, that true success is measured not by profit margins but by personal growth, and that sometimes, the most devastating setbacks pave the way for the most inspiring comebacks. Now, as I wrap up this chapter and look ahead to the future, I'm filled with a quiet confidence, a belief that no matter what happens, I have the strength and the drive to keep moving forward. I've turned betrayal into a blueprint for reinvention, and I'm ready to build a life that's entirely my own. My story isn't over, it's just beginning a new, exciting chapter, one where I'm in control, where my dreams take flight on my own terms, and where every setback is simply a setup for a comeback.